I'm Dr. Prabhakotishwaran. I'm a reader in Law and Social Justice at the Dixon Poon School of Law here at King's College London. And I'm also co-editor of Beyond Trafficking and Slavery, which is an editorial partnership between Open Democracy and researchers from Africa, Asia, America, Australia, and Europe. We seek to challenge as a group both the anti-sensationalism of mainstream media accounts of exploitation and domination and the hollow technocratic policy responses which are promoted by businesses and politicians. However, we at BTS are also interested in going beyond critique and asking what's next. In other words, how do we translate our critical voice into one that also engages with law and policymakers as well as other stakeholders in a meaningful way? With that in mind, we are here today to discuss the Modern Slavery Act of 2015, which was passed by the British Parliament in March 2015 with a view to eradicating modern slavery in the UK. And joining me today to discuss the Act is Mike Dottridge, a world-renowned expert on trafficking. Mike, welcome to King's.
Thank you.
So Mike, you've worked in this field of trafficking for decades now. Please tell us a little bit about your work in this area.
Well, I've worked in the field of human rights for a long time, for about 40 years. For the first half was mostly on civil and political rights. The second half wasn't really on trafficking. When I started in 1995 working for Anti-Slavery International, the word trafficking was assumed always to mean recruitment into prostitution. And because of the international law on the issue at the time, the 1949 convention, it was understood not to require coercion, so not to be the sort of forced slavery, even forced prostitution that our particular non-governmental organisation was concerned about. And in that context, then the adoption of a protocol on human trafficking 5 years later, now known as the Palermo Protocol, was important because it produced a new definition. I say important, not hugely positive, but important. And in the mid-90s, my focus was not on slavery either. It was very clear that there were very few cases of slavery, despite the fact that I was working for an organisation with the word slavery in the name. But there were plenty of cases of coercion, deception, forced labour as defined by international law, probably servitude, if only that was defined by international law. But and a great deal of our focus at Anti-Slavery International at that point was on bonded labour in South Asia, on what the Brazilians were already calling slave labour, which is not necessarily underpinned by debt, but is, or certainly was, underpinned by men with guns. So it was certainly a very coercive form of forced labour, even if it wasn't slavery. So I worked at Anti-Slavery International for 7 years. Then in 2002, shortly after the Trafficking Protocol was adopted by the UN, I started working independently. And since that 2002, I've had relatively little direct involvement here in the United Kingdom. Not only don't I live in London, but I left it, or I tried to leave it, to the organisation where I'd been director, Anti-Slavery International, to do the lobbying about UK laws and practice. Having said that, though, from time to time the UK has come and knocked me on the nose, and I've had to take an interest. A lot of my work has involved cases in either developing countries, in Southeast Europe. I suppose I followed the money in the sense that as an evaluator or a project planner, I've gone where organisations have money to invest and want me to do some work. But that enables me to see a little bit the situation here in the United Kingdom in an international perspective. And quite a lot I've been working with people in the United Nations human rights system, the various special rapporteurs and so on. And for the last 5 years I've been on what I always describe as the most minor of the United Nations committees, a board of trustees of a fund that has about $500,000 to spend each year as assistance to people who've been either trafficked or forced labour or subjected to other nasty forms of exploitation.
Great, thank you. So clearly, with someone with your level of experience, you would have seen the discourse around trafficking change even since the Palermo Protocol was adopted in 2000. So it seems like there have been many phases, many new vocabularies that have emerged in the past 15 years. Could you say a little bit about those terminologies and at what points they emerged?
Yes, certainly, but perhaps I'll even put it in a longer perspective, because seeing it, contrasting what happened after 2000 to the 5 previous years is also quite useful, in the sense that in the late 90s, before the Palermo Protocol was being negotiated, there was quite a busy civil war in the feminist movement between an extreme anti-prostitution wing, which talked about virtually all cases of sex work, of prostitution as trafficking, and wanted to appropriate the term trafficking in women and girls, because they were evidently not very interested in men and boys, versus a broader, still feminist movement that was opposed to any form of coercive trafficking, but which had, I suppose, a human rights stamp on it. A human rights meaning that if you want to be a sex worker, you have some entitlement to do that. If you want to survive, you have some entitlement to do that. You have rights. And that was quite a bitter debate. Only a couple of months ago, one of the organisations involved that was not on the same side as Anti-Slavery International wrote a kind of character assassination about me. So clearly there's a strong set of emotions that were in play there. Once the discussions opened in Vienna, initially it was very clear that the interest of the sponsoring states was Argentina, and I can't remember the other one, was again to follow up the 1949 Convention on Trafficking in Persons, was on prostitution. Once that started, we were in a kind of limbo for a while. Vienna was still a human rights free zone, although I was in contact with the advisor of the United Nations High Commission on Human Rights at the time, who tried to take human rights to the debates in Vienna. It was pretty clear early on that there was no inclination or interest among the delegations in Vienna to pick up that and to put strong human rights line into what became the Palermo Protocol. And it was very much crime fighters, as I suppose they'd like to be called, who were involved in setting the terms of the protocol. But there were some key developments at that point. The NGO, the organizer of the NGO lobby, an American woman called Ann Jordan, very much pushed to ensure that the definition of trafficking in the protocol would not be exclusively about sex, but would also relate to forced labour and other forms of exploitation. So we saw a protocol adopted that was extremely weak on protection, fairly incoherent on prevention, and I still haven't worked out quite who it was that said this is a protocol about 3 Ps, focusing on prevention, prosecution, and protection. It shouldn't have been true, and it unfortunately had an effect which is still there today of reducing what could have been a useful legal instrument to a sort of caricature. We saw a huge amount of scrabbling around for the first 5 years. I and others were summoned to repeated conferences to talk about conceptual clarity. In other words, to try and explain what the terms in international law that was cited by the Palermo Protocol actually meant. We failed. There are all sorts of terms such as, for example, practices similar to slavery, which has a very specific antecedent in a 1959 Convention, which are still utterly misunderstood by not only most law officers, but most laws, including the recent one in the United Kingdom. So we did a lot on conceptual clarity, with some reservations on my part. We saw then, despite the fact that the new convention didn't actually follow directly in the path of the 1949 convention, which was focused on prostitution, we saw the anti-prostitution lobby still claim it as their own. And it remained a human rights-free zone, certainly until 2002, where after I and others had been consulted and Gallagher drafted for the High Commissioner on Human Rights a set of recommended principles and guidelines on human rights and human trafficking. That sort of offered the human rights side, but at the time we knew that it would not be picked up if we put it to the what was then the Commission on Human Rights in Geneva, yet alone to the Vienna-based part of the United Nations. Indeed, the Vienna-based Secretariat sent a representative to the High Commissioner's office to lobby against the adoption of the recommended principles and guidelines. In the end, it was about 10 years before they were finally endorsed. They had quite a lot of influence early on, but we had this constant friction between a rather purist law enforcement approach and a human rights one, which would put not only a lot more emphasis on protection and assistance, but actually affects the whole menu as far as both coordination, prevention, and prosecution. What we also saw in the first 5 years was an extremely ineffective implementation of the prosecution provisions of the protocol. So the protocol was adopted a couple of years after being, came into force a couple of years after being adopted. Fairly soon it was going into legislation, and for the first decade there were a lot of complaints that it hadn't increased the number of prosecutions, and certainly not the number of convictions of traffickers that everyone had expected. And already by the second half of the decade, so certainly by 2007 or so, there were some quite experienced law enforcement officials who were pointing out that if you tried to convince a victim witness who'd been trafficked to testify without giving them adequate protection or assistance, there was not only an extremely small chance that they would testify, there was actually zero chance that they would testify. So by following the terms of the Palermo Protocol directly, actually it was self-defeating. It was only if what I would call a human rights approach, but others would call a more pragmatic approach to protection assistance was followed, that there was a hope in hell of the prosecutions succeeding. And as I say, there were people who were experienced in prosecuting trafficking or investigating or prosecuting trafficking cases before the year 2000 who already knew that. Certainly there was someone here in the Met trafficking and vice unit in the late 90s who could see that very clearly. I think elsewhere as well. So by the late part of the last decade, by about 2008, we began to see quite a lot more provisions, often not in law but in practice, to improve protection and assistance for victim witnesses. We also saw, I suppose, quite a lot of frustration among those that have been talking about conceptual clarity. I'm thinking in particular of a colleague based in Southeast Asia, Matt Friedman, who now runs the Mekong Club's anti-slavery, anti-trafficking program, and who in the second half of the last decade was running the United Nations Interagency Project against trafficking persons in the Greater Mekong sub-region, and who began to put a lot more emphasis on what he called the slavery outcomes of trafficking. In other words, rather than getting caught up in endless debates about what was trafficking and what wasn't, refocus on the exploitation involved. And of course, the extraordinary thing about the Trafficking Protocol is that it was adopted without a great deal of consensus or commitment to eradicating the exploitations that were the outcome of trafficking. This was very clearly in the case of what is nowadays called sex trafficking, but which in the protocol was called trafficking in persons for the purpose of the exploitation of others, or sex, or other forms of sexual exploitation. It was very clear that countries such as Netherlands were not willing to commit to enforcing legislation to stop any form of exploitation to the prostitution of others. But once the issue of exploitation of prostitution was linked to an abusive recruitment system, they were. In contrast, actually, in the case of forced labour and some of the other trafficking outcomes, I don't think there was anywhere ever any great disagreement with putting the emphasis on stopping the forms of exploitation. But that wasn't where the trafficking protocol put the emphasis, and it wasn't the effect of any legislation. Indeed, we ended up with some quite daft pieces of legislation, for example, in Brazil, where they had one set of laws dealing with slave labour, not focusing on recruitment, but on exploitation, and then developed some others on human trafficking, which were really all focused on recruitment into the sex industry, whether it was voluntary recruitment or not, so much more based on the pre-Palermo Protocol international instruments. So yes, there's been quite a lot of changes in the way that states have responded in the last 15 years. We've seen maybe 7 years with very little focus on human rights, 7 years where there's more, a little bit more care given to the idea that a victim witness needs protecting properly, protection as a victim of crime, but then also protection and support during the criminal justice process. I'm sure there is a country somewhere that would represent good practice, but I haven't yet come across it. So we'll see. Certainly a colleague of mine at Anti-Slavery wrote a sort of manual in about 2003 on what in-court protection should and could be for particularly adults who'd been trafficked. And it's still very rare to find most of those measures actually available, and even rarer to find them in generalised use in trafficking prosecutions.
That's great. Thanks, Mike. So you were the editor of a path-breaking report called Collateral Damage in 2007, which was published by the Global Alliance Against Trafficking Women, which mapped the unintended consequences of the Palermo Protocol. Has anything changed since then in the way that states are responding to the problem of trafficking? Sure, you've already mentioned that there's more protection for victims and greater consideration for their human rights. But has their focus on communities that they use these anti-trafficking initiatives against changed in any way?
No, I don't think so. I think we have a fundamental problem, which is that the Palermo Protocol is a law enforcement instrument. It needs far more, it needs to be complemented in a far more effective way by other instruments that would put the focus on identification and protection. But those are missing, except perhaps in the case of Council of Europe member states, where the 2005 Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings has put some of the missing pieces into place. We certainly saw some impact of that 2007 publication talking about collateral damage. The initial impact I noticed was at the level of international organisations, where staff sort of could see that what was being done about trafficking, human trafficking, was extremely imperfect, but knew that it was more than their job's worth to try and identify what the problem was. So at least once we had put this term collateral damage into onto the table, they could pick it up and use it usually in an elliptical way, saying, well, some people, Mike Dottridge and his co-conspirators, talk about collateral damage. So we got that concept in. In practice, the concept was already there in the 2002 UN High Commissioner on Human Rights principles and guidelines, but there it was fairly hidden away among other human rights issues. I looked this year to try and measure partly what was the effect of that 2007 report, partly to see whether there had been clear improvement, and the answer is nothing is clear in the world. There's been some dreadful instances since 2007 of states moving backwards. An obvious case is Mexico, which had adopted perhaps not very good legislation against trafficking, but it was still legislation based on the Palermo Protocol, so with the elements of a definition of trafficking in adults based on the Palermo Protocol, talking about recruitment with abusive means for a purpose of exploitation. And they've then adopted a subsequent law that has removed all reference to the abusive means. So we're back to a pre-2000 approach set in stone by the 1949 Convention. That's clearly inspired by ideologues in Mexico without any concern about the collateral damage, and Mexico remains a complete disaster area, both in terms of law enforcement in general, human rights in general, but very specifically as far as trafficking is concerned, enormous harassment of sex workers, even in the areas that the authorities declare fairly informally to be what they call zones of tolerance as far as sex work is concerned. And then there are other examples where things have certainly not got better, where legislation, certainly up until 2010, continued to be, what should we call it? I suppose you could call it simplistic. That would be a polite way of putting it. In other words, legislators, instead of looking at the situation in their country, the forms of exploitation that their nationals were being subjected to elsewhere or in their country, or that other non-nationals were being subjected to within the country's jurisdiction, and legislating to meet that, they simply took either the terms of the UN Trafficking Protocol, even if they made no sense to law enforcement officials in the country concerned, or even worse, they took the terms of the US law on trafficking in persons that was adopted a month before the Palermo Protocol. And it's worth pointing out that when a major superpower chooses to go in advance of international law, unfortunately it's really trying to break the consensus that the international community agrees upon. And the US chose to do that. I'm sure there have been some positive aspects from that. Certainly a lot of money that has flowed from Washington to anti-trafficking programs, national and local and regional, as a result of that US law. But it also managed to cause a fair amount of confusion. I wonder if there's anything else positive to say. There probably is, but what we can see is that sort of by about 2012, there was beginning to be a slightly more rounded approach to what was human trafficking. Some new players, for example, in South Asia, were beginning to finally engage on it. And of course, South Asia had chosen to point its nose in completely the opposite direction to the Palermo Protocol by adopting a regional instrument about trafficking that was based again on the 1949 Convention Against Prostitution, just after the Trafficking Protocol was adopted. by the beginning of this decade, they were paying more attention. It sort of looked as though we might be managing to introduce a bit more coherence, and then to pull away from the focus on law enforcement that had already been, as part of that focus on law enforcement, increasing attention given to the practical ways of identifying people that were trafficked or exploited, some of which was terrible, bad practice, but nevertheless it had happened. And then 2012 onwards, we have the reinvention of a new concept of modern slavery, which may or may not prove positive in the long term, but at the moment it's just caused more confusion. So in an international system that is not, at the best of times, inclined to do anything about exploitation, is very much inclined to use marvellous rhetoric to denounce the terrible, I can't even remember the words because I've banned them from my vocabulary, the terrible words that express the heinous is one of them, heinous exploitation involved. Yes, I mean, those same people usually sit on their hands when it comes to doing anything terribly useful, certainly in the form of protecting people. We've confused them yet again. Now, of course, they sometimes choose to be confused. Certainly in the United Kingdom, it's been intriguing. I've monitored, I think, 3 occasions where British government ministers have spoken out about the awfulness of the fact that there are migrants waiting in Calais to try and hop under a bus or onto a train or into a lorry to get into the United Kingdom. Classic sort of frontier jumping, but each time they've invoked the concept of trafficking, human trafficking, to say that by sending cops in to destroy the bush huts of these migrants, that both the French and the British law enforcement are contributing to stopping in trafficking in persons. I haven't yet worked out their logic, but I think my logic goes like this, which is that if you do have, amidst a bunch of irregular migrants, some who are being trafficked and who are going to be exploited on arrival, and you increase the costs of their migration by sending them back to their starting point or by sending them back 50 miles from Calais or anything, all you do is increase the debt that they're going to have to pay off. So actually what you've done is aggravate the situation, and possibly the person who's aggravated the situation like that should be regarded as a co-trafficker, certainly someone who has made the situation of a trafficked person worse.
That's very interesting, Mike. So actually what you're gesturing towards, and perhaps even articulating, is a more structural approach to inequalities in the world. And I was curious about what you think of the new player in the trafficking debates, or maybe not so new, but the ILO and its invocation of the need to address forced labor around the world, and then that brings in a contingent of NGOs and organizations that have been working on the field for many decades on the question of forced labor. And clearly academics have also now theorized this as a labor approach to trafficking, and which other academics have pointed out as probably an instance of what they call exploitation creep. So I just wondered what you would say to this new discourse around trafficking.
Well, certainly the ILO has a long history of working on forced labour. The problem until 2001 was that they didn't have a programme responding to forced labour. They had complaints going through their treaty monitoring body, and occasionally they would up the ante and order an international investigation, as they did in the 1990s concerning forced labour in Burma or Myanmar. The focus was there. The treaty monitoring body, which is meeting at the moment in December in Geneva, and then produces a report, a voluminous report on all the ILO's conventions each spring, had already by the late 90s redefined what the ILO meant by forced labour, from forced labour in a colonial situation, that's to say state agents coercing people to work, to encompassing the private sector. The ILO hadn't at that point got a centralised brain to really digest the consequences. So 1990s, their focus was on Burma. There were certain other situations that they were systematically not responding to. I remember particularly Sudan. And they then were negotiating 4 fundamental conventions in 1998 to involve a new procedure and a new convention about worse forms of child labour in 1999. And in effect, they were asleep when the debates started in Vienna about the Palermo Protocol. So they missed that particular bus in a way that I think was extremely counterproductive. However, under their 1998 instrument, they nevertheless had a 4-yearly report about forced labour, and that was the first time, apart from in the treaty monitoring bodies' reports, annual reports, that they were talking in a general way about forced labour. It was a good start. I think the first report was, I can't remember, it was 2001 or 2002, the first of the forced labour global reports, and it then led quickly to the appointment of the author, Roger Plant, to be the head of a new programme on forced labour, alongside one that had already existed on child labour for 10 years, as well, and then on 2 other issues, on discrimination and on freedom of association. However, I think it's fair to say that they got, if not torpedoed, then at least knocked sideways fairly quickly, because between their first report and their second one in 2005, the new Director General gave a clear instruction to his forced labour unit that they had to engage with numbers. And this was because a relatively, at that time, obscure academic called Kevin Bales had published a book in the late 1990s claiming that there were 27 million around the world in modern slavery, and the ILO didn't have a statistic. It did by then, the early part of the 21st century, have statistics about child labour, and it then put in 2004-05 a lot of energy in producing statistics. And my own personal view is that they then got hung up on someone else's paradigm, talking about numbers all the time, when actually what's needed always is good policy responses to forced labour. Eventually the ILO's moved ahead and instead of doing what it initially did, which was effectively say, look, we have a 1930 Convention number 29 on forced labour, let's just go with that rather than trying to come up with anything new. I think it's very fortunate that last year, 2014, they adopted a protocol to that convention that in effect drags it into the 21st century. But we still have again, I'm going to use a sort of an aggressive term, a civil war in the international community, in the intergovernmental community, about terminology. That's to say, with the UN coming out of Vienna, talking always about trafficking in persons, with the ILO wanting to talk about forced labour, with a few others in the Office of the High Commissioner occasionally saying, well, there might be cases of servitude as well, possibly even slavery. And then an additional complication, which is over the other side of the Atlantic, the United States, trying to call everything trafficking persons, whatever anyone else calls it, as well as quite a few other things. So even now with the ILO being much more focused, we still have a great deal of international confusion.
Great. So switching gears now a bit to the Modern Slavery Act of 2015, which was passed here in the UK. So tell us a little bit about your involvement in the processes that led up to its passage.
I had very little direct role at all, but I watched, I suppose, occasionally in an informed way, but usually quite uninformed. I had already before the Lib Dems and the Conservatives were elected and formed a joint coalition in 2010, I'd agreed to play a role as an editor of the first report produced by the UK's Anti-Trafficking Monitoring Group, which was an alliance of NGOs, formed immediately after the entry into force of the Council of Europe Convention on Action Against Trafficking in Human Beings in the UK in 2009. So I had a role as standing next to a gentleman that I wasn't entirely comfortable with, called Peter Bone, who was the new chair of the Parliamentary Anti-Trafficking Group in 2010, and launching that report. And then sort of watching what happened next. Well, the Anti-Trafficking Monitoring Group, I think, went on doing extremely good quality monitoring work. That first report used words like, I think there were rather stronger words than dysfunctional. It was describing the anti-trafficking system in the UK as not fit for purpose. And subsequent reports then focused on different parts of the anti-trafficking system and were not particularly more complementary. But at some point, and I suppose it must have been 2011-12, some movers and shakers in the Conservative Party evidently decided that the issue of slavery, if not trafficking, is one that they wanted to pick up on. Now, there's a couple of things that had happened I suppose quite a few that had happened in the previous decade in the UK that had influenced that. I mean, the first thing to comment on is that there'd been a series of law reforms which suggested that the UK legislator was incoherent about what he or she was trying to stop. The best piece of legislation had nothing to do with trafficking, ostensibly. It was the gangmasters' licensing legislation in 2004 or 5 that went through after the terrible tragedy in Morecambe Bay when cockle pickers lost their lives, and that galvanised not only trade unions and public opinion, but also parliamentarians on both sides of the House. But otherwise, the legislation was fairly incoherent. And it then got worse after 2010 because as part of its anti-migration or anti-immigration drive, the coalition government reintroduced precisely the limitations on migrant domestic workers' right to change their employers, which I and others had campaigned against in the 1990s. And I remember very explicitly when Tony Blair's government had changed the legislation, I guess it was 98, but it could have been as early as 97, they actually asked us, please, don't make a fuss about this. We know you'll be pleased, but we don't want to give anything to the anti-immigration lobby in the other party. That was in the late 90s. So we had some very negative things happen in 2010-11. But someone in the Tory party evidently looked at their great early 19th century anti-slavery campaigner, William Wilberforce, and thought, we have an opportunity to recapture the halo, as it were. And it could have been that they were thinking strategically, I've no idea, and actually knew that in the last year of a coalition government they would not be able to pass any meaningful new legislation, and therefore the issue of slavery was put on the agenda. I don't know how it happened, but either way it was Ian Duncan Smith's think tank that did the groundwork and produced a report, I think at the beginning of 2012, with Frank Field at the head of it, as it were, which created the groundwork for what happened subsequently. And I guess that was a very deliberate attempt to be bipartisan. The Lib Dems weren't really anywhere to see. It was essentially a sort of Tory Labour or Tory Conservative with a small c Labour alliance that went after that helped produce that first report in 2012. It scarcely acknowledged the importance of the anti-trafficking monitoring group's report. It was really trying to put across a version which is, we've discovered this problem and want to do something about it. which is fine. You know, if that was a route to effective new legislation, it would have been great. And Frankfield then played a key role right up until 2014, both before and after new legislation was proposed. And each time did the right thing. I mean, he and his colleagues did put a lot of emphasis on the need for protection. I didn't know quite who to engage, and eventually in early 2014 I was asked to go and testify before, or go and provide information to a parliamentary, a joint House of Lords Commons committee, but only on the issue of children and of what legislative provisions would be suitable to define exploitation of children. And so I only had one direct interchange with parliamentarians, which confirmed that they still didn't have a great deal of knowledge of what the state's legal obligations already were under the 1956 Supplementary Convention or the ILO instruments and so on, which again doesn't, needn't in theory matter, but it sort of worried me at the time. And the legislation ultimately reflected those weaknesses. In other words, because an unknown, anonymous barrister was quoted to me and others as saying that it would be very difficult if the definition of trafficking or slavery regarding a child was different to that of an adult. Because of that, as I say, an anonymous barrister, there was a great deal of reticence to implement the provisions of the 1956 Supplementary Convention on Slavery and the Slave Trade, or indeed the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Sale of Children, both of which make it absolutely crystal clear that there are slavery-like offences that are committed against children because they're children, mainly when children are taken away from their birth family to be exploited, to be made to work and to make a profit for someone else. That's still not very explicit in the Modern Slavery Act, so I think all my advocacy probably failed there.
So fascinating, Mike, because it's likely that one would find a similar political milieu in other parts of the world where the rhetoric around trafficking or modern slavery or, pick your term of choice, really doesn't offer a possibility for civil society actors who have been working on these issues for decades to actually come forth with their expertise. Nevertheless, what is your sense more broadly of how civil society actors were able to engage with lawmakers when in fact the Modern Slavery Act was being debated in Parliament? I mean, in other words, what kinds of political opportunities and institutional spaces do you think civil society actors managed to identify, target, and make their presence felt within?
Well, I think that the lobbyists looked at every opportunity and took advantage of every opportunity. That means there was, I can't now remember the full process, but before any legislation was announced by the Home Secretary in late 2013, there was already a first opportunity to for civil society in general to interact with a first commission or committee that Frankfield was chairing. Then there was a second one where I did something in early 2014. And then there was the opportunity to lobby individual MPs and, rather more relevantly, members of the House of Lords. Now, as someone with Republican sympathies, I don't, in principle, have a great deal of sympathy for a rather outmoded second chamber such as the House of Lords. However, I have to acknowledge that one of my former colleagues who's remained behind from the old inherited Lords days, Lord Sandwich, is a great lobbyist on this issue. And then one other, Lord Hilton, should be given the Human Rights Prize as far as the Modern Slavery Act is concerned, because he went on struggling until the very last days in March 2015 to get the right sort of provisions put in as far as migrant domestic workers are concerned. And these were individuals who'd already shone in the late 90s, so there was nothing new. There were a few in the Lords, new people, and in the Commons very clearly there were new ones. But there were others, fortunately, who had already done the right thing at earlier legislation opportunities. So they knew what they were talking about. In contrast, I have to say, to the Home Office's team, who didn't really seem to me to know quite what they were on about. I remember giving them a copy of the United Nations commentary, quite detailed text on the principles and guidelines on human rights and human trafficking. I suspect it was put away on a rather high shelf. I had hoped it would be consulted as legislation was developed. And certainly when the first legislation came out, I thought it was wacky. I think my colleagues who were lobbying more directly were more polite. And they did a great deal to improve it. That was ultimately the important thing. As long as the ruling party or the dominant parties are opposed to certain what I could call anti-slavery as well as anti-trafficking provisions, such as the key one of ensuring that migrant domestics are able to change their employer. As long as that's the case, they can pass as many modern slavery acts as they like, but ultimately they are facilitating slavery and exploitation.
So I guess we've already launched really into a critique of the Modern Slavery Act, and I'm glad you did. And so I'm just curious, how should we assess it? Now it's sunk in. It's been 6 months since the act was passed. And so what were some of the missed opportunities and what were the unexpected wins in the process leading up to the act?
Well, as you've already heard, I think the opportunity was to push on behalf of migrant domestics. The relevant non-governmental organisation, Collateral, pulled out all the stops, did everything it could, and it met a brick wall. So let's face it, there's people in our legislature who approve of exploitation, but don't say so. There was a lot else going on. We had some super opportunities created. I think the main one is on the transparency in supply chains provision, which, as far as I can understand, the government was quite opposed to allowing to surface, to rear its head. And indeed, some of us, such as myself, looking at the California Act, that was the sort of first precedent in this domain, had some anxiety that act hadn't yet proved that it was really worth that it was actually achieving anything. But I nevertheless saw that those supply chain provisions as something really significant and creating space to then move ahead and explore more. And that's precisely what the movers and shakers, for example, the Ethical Trading Initiative and some others are now doing. And it does indeed secure the attention of corporate lawyers in a way that certainly nothing in the original bill was going to. The original bill and the act both have stuff on prevention that I found incoherent. I'm not quite sure why. There's quite a lot to do with prevention in the British tradition, preventive detention orders and others, which seem to be violations of human rights rather than anything else. So perhaps I looked rather askance at some of these prevention orders, but they did seem to me to be trying to fill up space with smoke rather than meaningful measures. I can see the whole message that if you let people off with a light sentence, clearly there is no deterrence. You don't need to be a hugely qualified criminal lawyer or indeed judge to know that there's ways of making sentences more severe without spending a lot of parliamentary time talking about preventive measures and so on. Again, at the beginning of the legislative process, the government seemed absolutely committed to not appointing a national rapporteur. And indeed before the law was finalised, we already had the appointment of an anti-slavery commissioner. So that was a big shift. I'd been involved already back in, I can't remember if it's 96 or 97, when there was a European Union justice ministers meeting in The Hague, and the Dutch, who'd already appointed a national rapporteur, launched the idea of every country appointing one, and every country went away and did precisely nothing for several years. Ultimately, that was taken up by particularly the European Commission, the European Union, a little bit the Council of Europe, but their 2005 convention doesn't specify as rigorously that there has to be a national rapporteur. Here in the UK, certainly the NGOs, both before and after the formation in 2009 of the Anti-Trafficking Monitoring Group, had been putting a lot of emphasis on the importance of an independent monitor, an independent rapporteur. That was because some of us could see that even among law enforcement agencies, there was incoherence. There was an unwillingness to exchange information, intelligence, an unwillingness to refocus on protection needs rather than giving priority to weeding out false asylum claims or now false trafficking claims. The interesting thing, in a sense, was that rather as the US went in front of the UN back in 2000, so the Home Secretary chose to run ahead of legislation and appoint a commissioner already in the autumn of 2014 rather than waiting for the Act to be adopted. And possibly that was to reduce the influence of Parliament on the mandate and who she could appoint as a commissioner and so on. And there's still some things there that are unsatisfactory on paper, and I don't know how it's working out in practice. But the good thing is that in practice, once we have an institution, even if that institution has to fight for resources and initially is not being given much information by any other part of the establishment, law enforcement or others, with the right people in the post, they will get there and hopefully will then have influence. I think we can measure that influence particularly by looking at the issue of migrant domestic workers. I think the Commissioner is very happy to have scored already in the international arena by influencing the terminology in the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN General Assembly has adopted in September 2015, where Goal 8.7 had very much been formulated by the ILO with a focus on forced labour, a reference to trafficking, and then some detail which I regard as completely unachievable on child labour. But the result of the British intervention was that the term modern slavery was introduced into that development goal. So for better or worse, that's there. I think probably it's useful that it is there, because otherwise for the last 3 years we've had a lot of fog put up about modern slavery without it being at all clear what it is. And at the international level, working a little bit in the UN system, we had no plank, that we had no reference to modern slavery anywhere. We had this rather obscure one to contemporary forms of slavery that was agreed back in the early 1980s, but not modern slavery. So the fact that it's in a sustainable development goal probably helps us, and I suspect then we now rely on the International Labour Office to put some flesh on that, probably forming some sort of alliance of either international organisations, maybe backed by some states, to bring about the implementation of it. Although, as I say, my concern is that their focus is on child labour and is quite unachievable.
Great, thank you. So it's still early days, and you've given us a wonderful example of how the terminology around modern slavery is already making its way into international strategic documents. So what is your sense from speaking to domestic players or even international players on how the Modern Slavery Act is being operationalized? And even if we don't have enough yet to decide where it's going, could you say a little bit about what you think the likely consequences might be of its enforcement? Because often the passage of a law is purely a symbolic move. And, prosecutors know very well that they actually don't need the Modern Slavery Act to target trafficking, and by the same token, having it may not make much of a difference.
Well, that's right. I think in terms of law enforcement that it hasn't made much difference and won't make much difference. Everywhere there's the same problem, which is that to prove an actual trafficking offence, when the legislation requires the same three elements as the trafficking protocol, the Palermo Protocol demands, that's to say that there is an act such as recruitment or harbouring, an abusive means such as exploitation of someone's vulnerability, and a purpose of exploitation. That's too much, I have to say, as having talked to many cops as well or investigators as well as prosecutors. It's not asking for the impossible. It's difficult, and I don't really think the Modern Slavery Act makes it much easier. We'll see. So we're back to the other side that you've mentioned, which is the symbolism of the Modern Slavery Act. So the British officials proclaimed that this was putting them back in the lead of the world campaign against slavery. Well, the lead perhaps, but several kilometres behind the United States, I'm afraid. And I say that because I would quite like the United States not to be in the lead. I don't think it's an appropriate place for them to be, but the British are clearly not overtaking. However, in Europe it has some ripple effects. First of all, we now have an anti-slavery commissioner who's fairly independent, not as structurally independent as I would like from the Home Office, but fairly independent, who is interacting with other national rapporteurs under the coordinating umbrella of the European Union's anti-trafficking coordinator. The coordinator and that group have done some things. I mean, it hasn't been very effective so far. So I would hope that the anti-slavery commissioner can galvanise them a bit. At the level of the supply chain side, there are things happening, and I think again there's a potential for Britain's new legislation to have some, not sort of to cause others to suddenly say, oh, we should do the same, but rather to interact with things that the European Union is now doing. That might mean that within the coming decade we see quite a lot of what some people would call cleaning up of supply chains. But anyway, greater and more substantial attempts to ensure that imports into European Union states are not produced by either trafficked workers or workers who've been subjected to extreme exploitation, which might not constitute forced labour or trafficking, but is quite close to it. But we're a long way from having, at the moment, clarity either about what levels of exploitation are unacceptable or what evidence is necessary. So we'll see whether that moves things forward. Any other fronts? Well, I'm sure there are some. On protection, I just don't think the British have yet got a model to offer to the world. I think they're stuck, and it would require some political resolve to move them out of, I won't say they're in the Stone Age, but out of the not very happy place where they've put their protection system.
Great. So what's next? I mean, how does one now regroup, as it were, in the face of this new act? Should we try and pursue more meaningful enforcement of certain provisions that we think might be beneficial? What are the points of leverage? And should we also continue to think big? Will there be future opportunities for amendments to the Act or for institutional reform in certain respects that would actually enhance what you've already proposed as a structural approach to dealing with trafficking?
Well, I think it's the structural approach that's necessary, which means keeping your eye on the labour market and really seeing visa regimes as a key mechanism for reducing levels of trafficking and exploitation. So my answer depends on whether I'm required to think in terms of Britain's political life over the next 4.5 years with the same government in power, in which case I can't really be very optimistic, or whether I should think and speak in terms of a rather more idealistic advocacy agenda, which would be certainly pushing for a much more holistic gangmasters licensing agency approach that would absolutely extend their mandate from the rather restricted area in which it is at the moment to a whole load of other industries and economic sectors in which gangmasters or recruitment agencies are active and migrant workers are being seriously exploited. In all of that, I suppose I think it's institutions such as the Gangmasters Licensing Agency that have the best potential to come up with meaningful definitions of what the problem is. The problem is not forced labour as defined by the ILO 1930 Convention or trafficking as defined by the 2000 UN Palermo Protocol. It's to do with very nasty forms of exploitation of workers, which enable employers, in effect, to underpay or not to pay to get more overtime than is justifiable, to ruin people's lives in a nasty way. And it requires a holistic approach, not to just say, well, this is slavery, we should stop it, but to a whole sector which is an important key to the United Kingdom's economic growth and which legislators therefore don't want to impede. So that's difficult to see that that's going to make headway, but I think advocates need to ensure that the Gangmasters Licensing Agency is not hampered from doing its work in the way that the last Parliament hampered it by reducing its resources, by subjecting it to the same analysis as other parastatal agencies, which was to try and reduce so-called red tape, but in that case, effectively to reduce protection. And yes, anyway, so that's pretty clear to me. I don't think the Gangmasters legislation is the right instrument to use as far as migrant domestics is concerned. I can't think of any possible moral or other justification for not going back to the reforms of the late 1990s when migrant domestic workers were allowed to change employers. That didn't put an end to all exploitation of migrant domestic workers. That's one of the problems. That goes on. But at the moment we've gone back to the Stone Age, as it were. We've gone back to a pre-Wilberforce stage where the UK's own legislation appears to favour exploitation and abuse of migrant workers. Should I say more? I think that's already sort of some important stuff. On transparency, yes, clearly there are big opportunities, not only in terms of the UK, but because the whole business and human rights agenda is open to being influenced. That agenda at the international level got kicked off soon after the Berlin Wall came down, when, as a result of the ending of the East-West confrontation, the East, as it were, stopped pushing uniquely for provisions that would punish Western transnational, multinational companies. and refocused on a general approach to business. We saw some good initiatives in the beginning of the last decade. They were then sort of suspended by the UN Commission on Human Rights, while Professor John Ruggie was appointed Special Representative on Human Rights and Business. And he came up with a very good set of guidelines, but they are strictly nice and theoretical. They're not being implemented in any sort of hard-hitting way. And the UN itself didn't adopt a follow-up mechanism that would ensure that not only that any teeth were put on his guiding principles, but that anything substantial would be done. Now we have another situation that takes us back a bit to the Cold War days in the United Nations Human Rights Council, where there is a new measure to make rather anti-business provisions into a legal instrument. I suspect it won't succeed, but it means that the attention at that level has been drawn away. And that in turn means that practical ways of implementing the UK Act's transparency and supply chain provisions are rather important, precisely because at the higher level of the UN, nothing much is going on or nothing is coming out that's useful. We'll see whether the International Labour Organization that is going to discuss supply chains in 2015 gets anywhere. It might move a little bit, but I suspect it'll have difficulty in moving very far. So on the ground provisions like the California Act, like any US-wide follow-up to that California Act, and like the UK Modern Slavery Act supply chain provisions, are interesting to see how they can be developed, because they're not there as simply something to implement. They're there as a small plant that could grow. And ultimately, we do need to see whether it could grow into something useful. There is a huge potential for it to grow into something really counterproductive. And I will then write yet another collateral damage report that says we wanted to stop goods made by slave labour being traded in the international system, but by enabling particularly industrialised countries, giving them a moral argument for not importing certain products, we legitimised all sorts of trade discrimination. And we'll need some better brains on it than we've got at the moment. I mean, I see who is publishing within the UN system about supply chains, who is talking about it. And there really is a need for someone to get their head around what does it mean that in a certain country, the bricks that build the factory, as well as the workers that work in the factory, as well as the agents that sell the products, are all being exploited in various either illegal or at least unacceptable ways. And in all that, we're going to come back to the fact that talking about modern slavery is not sufficient. Talking about trafficking and forced labour is not sufficient. We actually need to persuade the international community to identify rather more explicitly what severe forms of exploitation are unacceptable. And the intriguing thing is that this year at least, the place where that debate has moved forward is in Vienna, in the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Commission, which has published a report that is explicitly not about trafficking or forced labour, but is about severe forms of exploitation. They've gone somewhere where, for example, Brazil went in the mid-90s. Brazil had defined what was slave labour, which was what we would elsewhere in the world would have called trafficking, and then workers held at gunpoint in Amazonia. And they were then looking at the next worst cases that weren't as bad. There wasn't a gunman, but workers, usually in the bush, were living in completely subhuman conditions, and let's say being discouraged from trying to escape. It was something very close. It would probably in the UK be defined as forced labour, but not in Brazil. And it was, at that time, Brazil failed to legislate and get across a detailed definition, anyway, of what extreme exploitation consists of, and they're still suffering as a result of that. So I'm not sure where, other than in the International Labour Organization, where that agenda can be taken forward. I think probably we have to wait until the ILO has sorted out all the weaknesses it suffered from being asleep at the end of the 1990s on the trafficking issue. And once they've got that and got there, then we could begin to push them to look a little bit further beyond forced labour and not encourage them to do on forced labour what they've done on child labour, which is to say, well, everything is forced labour or everything is child labour. We have that push from the modern slavery lobbyists. I mean, last year we saw an increase in the estimates by the Global Slavery Index of the number of people in slavery from something like 29 million to 36 million. You know, for those of us who know the evidence, we either laughed or cried, but it wasn't anything we could take very seriously.
That's a really, really interesting observation. So do you think that there is any other domestic legal mechanism that we could look to in any part of the world? Or, as you said, do we have to wait for the impetus to come from perhaps the ILO, which has worked in this area for a long time?
No, I think if we can refocus on identification and protection from law enforcement, and that we could make strides ahead, and that countries, if we had a different government in India, it would be India I'd be quoting, maybe Nepal could, I'm not sure. And what in effect I'm saying is, look, the level of evidence you need to prosecute someone is beyond reasonable doubt. The level of evidence that as either an administrator or even a law enforcement official that I would need in order to say, well, this person is in forced labour or bonded labour or whatever, and therefore should come out, is not the same. It's a much lower level of evidence. Such provisions for identification and release need to be matched by protection. And the big problem we've had in India for the last 40 years is inadequate protection, as well as inadequate general enforcement of the 1976 Bonded Labour System Abolition Act. But next year will be the 40th anniversary of that act, as well as what do we have? 60th anniversary of the 1956 Convention, the 90th, lots of anniversaries, the 90th anniversary of the original League of Nations Slavery Convention. So we've got a lot of things coming up which could be used to galvanise South Asia into more effective action. And they could take the lead, just as Brazil could and did at various points, takes the lead, and certainly are in a much better position to take the lead than countries, the industrialised countries, in my view. I'm not sure whether the United States or the UK or others would be in favour of that. And on the whole, they sort of, I fear, prefer to wave the hat and wave the flag and claim that they're leading the world in anti-slavery when it is largely rhetoric.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. I'm now coming back to the question of this field of trafficking. How do you see it developing over the next 10 years? I mean, is this modern slavery paradigm, it's so dangerously seductive as some scholars have observed, and simply reiterates the powers of the state, the carceral powers of the state? Or do you really think it has the potential for addressing, questions of socioeconomic justice for very vulnerable and increasingly mobile workers in this globalized world?
Yes, I don't think really either the trafficking paradigm or the modern slavery one help us get to the solutions. They get us to not even a halfway house, a quarter-way house. And perhaps in some ways they're intended to be the salve that stops us needing to find a solution. I don't know what's the motivation of some of the people that are now being called philanthro-capitalists to get involved in the anti-slavery work. I suspect their motivation is excellent. But in a way it looks as though those that are profiting most from fairly unrestrained capitalism are keen to see the worst forms of exploitation addressed without the slightly less bad forms of exploitation being addressed. And there will go on being the same argument that I've had with people over the last 20 years, which is that despite exploitation, there are all sorts of advantages in the economic development that goes with fairly savage capitalism. It was, in a sense, the same sort of arguments we've had here in the UK at the end of the 1990s and beginning of the 20th century, when migrant domestics didn't want to be described ever as trafficked. Now, at that point, it was because they saw it as the stigma of sex work and prostitution. But it was also because they said, look, don't try and impose the minimum wage on us. The advantage we have in the labour market is that we're cheaper than the minimum wage. We're outside the minimum wage, but we're cheaper than the minimum wage. And therefore, we get by and we have employment here. And that, for us, is the priority. It's a little bit the same in my discussions about bonded labour. I can see that my various ancestors who had debts could be described as being in bondage, but each of them clearly saw it as a means to an end, a period of apprenticeship or various other restrictions that would eventually get them, if not to the promised land, at least to a good income stream. And at the moment, most of the terminology and most of the thoughts that go into anti-trafficking, anti-forced labour provisions are crude, aren't they? And they certainly aren't trying to do anything to help people who want to move from one country to another, who can't possibly get a loan from the formal sector, from the banking sector to do so, and who therefore have to take loans and do end up routinely in debt bondage. To consider all those people as slaves and to describe them as slaves that should be released, I suspect that's really not what they want, and certainly some of them have talked to me say that wasn't what they want. So we need some rather more sophisticated ways of distinguishing between people who are really in a form of captivity and don't want to be, others who do want to work but just want rather more acceptable working conditions or contracts. And in general, in trying to persuade legislators that either going back to an old sort of nationalist agenda and saying buy British, only employ British workers or whatever, is not the way that the 21st century needs to go. But also, with various other respects that they need to adjust to. It's not just a 21st century labour market, it's really a post-1989 labour market. And right throughout the industrial world, we've got models for monitoring labour abuse and so on, which are pre-1989, pre-migration, and which are not fit for purpose. They really aren't fit for purpose. The ILO acknowledges that occasionally, but we're still stuck with, labour inspectorates and things which are really got mandates from the 19th century rather than the 20th century, let alone fit for the 21st century. So there's a lot still to do.
Mm-hmm. So I think that the biggest takeaway for me from our conversation is precisely what you just said, which is being able to anticipate unintended consequences, which I think, beyond just being good progressives, really getting to the nub of the economic question and to say, what are the unintended consequences of apparently progressive regulatory moves or economic moves? So I just want to end by asking you what kinds of strategies you think we should train our eyes towards, clearly with a view to avoiding these kind of unintended consequences. If there were 5 strategies you would suggest that, either us NGO folks, academics go off and work on, what would those be?
This is a bit like taking sort of 5 tracks of music to my tropical island. I shall do my best to turn the 5 into 25. And that's because the first strategy would be research, but immediately research on two different things. So I don't know whether that's one strategy or two. We need always better research than we're getting on what's happening in terms of exploitation. And although there are areas that are really of criminal exploitation, there are others in which research is not impossible. I mean, as I say, the Gang Masters Licensing Agency, I think, collects very good information about what is happening in all sorts of sectors. So we need that about the patterns of exploitation. And then to track collateral damage, we need much better research on the impact of all sorts of changes, legislative changes, changes related to protection, changes related to the labour market, whether it's visa regimes or other labour market legislation. I mean, I was in one former Soviet country recently, which for a while in the last decade had the reputation of being the largest source of trafficked women and girls, Moldova. And talking to a government official dealing with trafficking there, I mean, she sort of let drop, and as an aside, because it didn't for her, it didn't require thinking, which was basically that if once Moldovans had the right to a visa or a visa-free regime, the scale of trafficking and of unacceptable exploitation didn't just reduce, it disappeared. So a country can move very sharply from a high level of exploitation of its immigrants to a very low level or a much lower level, very fast. And this is the problem, I suppose, with the trafficking protocol view of what the causes are. Poverty and various things are mentioned, and we're going to educate kids, and it's great that we're going to have sex education in schools, but government and state responsibility for trafficking are systematically denied by the trafficking protocol, and therefore aren't addressed. And that's a major problem. So research, I don't know whether that's one or two strategies. Well, certainly we then need research on a different area, an area which has had attention in a very sporadic and unprofessional way, which is on data available about products in the world trade market that are made with some or a lot of trafficked or forced labour. And I think we need to move towards potentially indicting a state for failing to act with due diligence when they don't interfere to stop such products being sold in their markets. Now, we've had a completely different neoliberal approach to, and one that's regarded as the only acceptable approach by the World Trade Organization, which is to push responsibility onto individual retailers and businesses, but really just moral responsibility, and for the state to accept no legal responsibility. But the state has huge responsibility for a number of things. I mean, firstly, for its own procurement, which, if you look at a national economy, is usually between large and vast. And then in terms of what is being imported, I mean, a country like the UK, it would be a large ask to say you should be vetting all the imports. So I'd go to the other end and say, what about the ones where it is glaringly obvious that we are buying stuff here that is made in completely unacceptable conditions. So then what are those completely unacceptable conditions? I mean, for me, it's just unacceptable that the World Trade Organization has looked in the opposite direction. I think the British would say it was Nelson at the Battle of Copenhagen putting a telescope to his blind eye and pretending that forced labour, that labour exploitation doesn't exist and doesn't need to be taken into account. And as I've said, there's a huge potential problem of different states putting up trade barriers. I think the report that the US government already produces about goods involving child labour or forced labour is already problematic in many respects. And every app or other product that so-called anti-slavery organisations have suggested in order to identify what goods it is morally or legally acceptable to buy, it looks to me to be full of shortcomings. However, it's still an area to work on and look at. And then, I mean, it's not going to surprise you, here in the UK, I think we need clearly not just to leave it to Callahan to look after the ongoing advocacy on behalf of migrant domestic workers. I think that needs, in a way, a constant reiteration of the problem, and we'll have to see whether the Anti-Slavery Commissioner takes a lead there or feels a need to toe the government line, and then react to that accordingly. And I've talked a bit about international and a bit about national, and I know that's not very helpful because it's clearer if it's a very clear national agenda. But in terms of international priorities, right at the beginning, so 2003-04, within Europe, and produced by the OSCE, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and its special human rights organisation based in Warsaw, there was a lot of focus on identification and referral systems. And since then, we've seen a lot of monitoring and a lot of failures and weaknesses in prosecution. We haven't seen nearly enough attention to monitoring the way that the early stages of identification are carried out, whether it's of trafficked people, forced labour, exploitation of prostitution, whatever it is. It's that early stage that is the current, it's not the weak link, it's the absent link, because often it's not clear which government agency is responsible. When it is clear, it turns out that the agency's agents don't know how to do it, or don't have a mandate to do it, or don't do it, or don't have a bicycle to get on to cycle down and look, all sorts of things. So that requires monitoring and advocacy in order to make protection then a priority. And that's certainly a need in the UK as it is in elsewhere.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mike, for this.
Probably far more than 5.
We are better off for those more than 5 suggestions. Thank you so much for speaking with us today.
You're very welcome.